Welcome to the Alfi podcast, episode 6. This one is a fascinating one for me. I hope you enjoy this. Make sure to subscribe, share, and like, and definitely stay tuned. This is a really interesting discussion about a book that I read. I have my special guest, Gigi, Michelle Zoltan, here with me.
Hey. So what are we going to talk about today?
I don't know. What are we going to talk about today?
I think we should discuss this book that you can't stop talking about. It's The Breath of Life or Malrespiration by George Catlin. You said that this was written about 200 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
I have heard quite a bit about this book the last couple of weeks since he's been going through it. So I think you should tell the audience about what you've learned.
Yeah. This is my favorite book that I've read this year. It's really fascinating. It's a short read. I highly recommend everybody pick it up and read it. It was written in 1864.
Okay.
This was a time where President Abraham Lincoln was in charge of the country. There were, I think, 36 states
Yeah, so America wasn't
in the
even
Union.
the current America.
And this gentleman, George Catlin, I think was a lawyer for about 3 years in his career. And he was interested in writing and painting.
Okay.
He decided to dedicate his life to following and living with Native American tribes across North and South America. And he traveled with them, 150 different tribes, and painted them and wrote about them. And what really became fascinating to him and made him really curious was that he began to admire the Native Americans for their superior health and physique compared to the so-called civilized communities that he grew up with. Meaning that in his studies, they had things called censuses, like a census called the Bills of Mortality from London, for example. And the average age was, I think, 50s or 60s. And people died of illnesses, lung respiratory illnesses. They had diseases. They had scoliosis, things that riddle modern day man as well. And half of children died before the age of 3.
Mm-hmm.
And mothers giving birth at a high mortality rate. What he noticed following these tribes is that there was no infant mortality rate that he ever saw, or that the medicine man in each community would support. So it seemed like there was no infant mortality rate, and there was no mothers dying of childbirth. And these people, although they lived on dirt and lived in teepees and didn't have the same resources that the civilized communities have, they lived longer lives. I think he said double, which obviously 100 years old doesn't make sense in that time, but they lived longer lives. They did not have scoliosis. They did not have respiratory illnesses. They seemed to live not only longer lives, but much healthier and happier lives. And physically, they were stronger. They stood straighter. They had stronger jaws. They had healthy teeth. They didn't lose their teeth to decay. Their teeth were straighter. And they didn't use toothbrushes, and they didn't have dentists. And the mothers giving birth didn't have doctors. Yet, they had a clear and obvious, hard to ignore difference in what seemed like better health. So that became his fascination to see what is it of civilized worlds, of the sanitary lifestyle, that seemingly was contributing to this deterioration in human condition. So it's fascinating because, we can never mimic these type of lives, right?
Right.
I don't think there are 150 tribes to follow in abundance nowadays, obviously.
Unfortunately, no.
And there isn't also writers and painters that completely go and take off and spend their entire life dedicated to such a cause. Or if they do, it's very limited in nature, right? We have so many more resources, interests, and conveniences in life where times have just changed. So it's a really interesting historical perspective. His goal for the book, once he came to his conclusion, and we're going to talk about that obviously, was to make this, to have it as a resource for the medical community so that the medical community can actually benefit from these observations and it's been about 200 years or close to it. And his work never took acceptance into the medical community up until probably now. I found this book and I found it very interesting. I really thank one of our patients, Vanessa. You know who you are. Thank you for recommending this book. I think it was really interesting. And I think all the viewers are going to think it's interesting. So his common denominator.
Yeah, what's the common denominator? Why is it that the Native Americans live longer lives, healthier lives, better lives than most people even in today's day and age do?
Yeah. So his conclusion was that the major difference was it was a very strict part of the culture, the Native American culture, to keep their lips closed.
Mm-hmm.
Meaning they always were breathing through their nose. And this was an integral part of their culture.
Mm-hmm.
It was an intentional part of their culture because they themselves noticed that mouth breathing causes illnesses and distorted faces. And nasal breathing makes better faces and healthier people. So this is something they knew.
Mm-hmm.
And they seldom spoke. Their lips were closed. They would only speak in short amounts and necessary times. Obviously, we're very different.
Yes.
We speak a lot, oftentimes unnecessarily.
That is correct.
They would open their mouths to eat, which they didn't snack all day. The rest of the time, they made sure that their lips were closed so that they were breathing through their nose.
And didn't you also mention that in the book, they spoke about how mothers made it an integral part of taking care of their newborns to monitor their sleep and to ensure that the newborns are always closing their lips when they were sleeping.
Exactly. So this was a big part of their training. The mothers were known to be the physicians of their babies.
Mm-hmm.
And one of their biggest roles was as the baby or infant was sleeping, they would make sure that they were up all night or much of the night paying attention to the baby's sleep and making sure that the lips were closed. And if it wasn't, they would close the lips and train the infant to breathe through their nose. And this was known to be a very critical thing in their upbringing so that that habit would continue for the rest of their lives, which it did in these people. The other thing he attributes is that a more civilized community with their resources slept in heated rooms with large animal blankets. He contributed that to having the mouths open as well. Even today, we don't wake up a sleeping baby, right? Mm-hmm. It's just part of our culture, even if the babies are sleeping with their mouth open, to let them sleep. But this was a difference in what he was observing. Mm-hmm. And it was really the biggest common denominator that he attributed to. So he paid attention to this, and then he started paying attention to what it meant when people were mouth breathing and what can happen. This is what was really fascinating to me. He came to the same conclusions that we're coming to now, as an oral surgeon who does jaw surgery, interested in airway. We talk about this stuff all the time. Mm-hmm. We know that mouth breathing elongates the face, right, develops a recessed jaw, narrow arches, crowds the teeth, and that causes sleep issues and so many other chronic illnesses. Right. And this is exactly what he's demonstrating in this book through literary work, through his findings, and he writes about it, but also through his illustrations, and it's really interesting.
Scanning through the book, because I haven't read it, but from what you have shown me in that book, it's very interesting how the faces that he shows of the people who are mouth breathing versus the ones who are not are so similar to the people who mouth breathe today.
Correct.
And it's very interesting how nothing really has changed in the last 200 years as far as mouth breathing goes. Like, it's showing that with mouth breathing, your jaw's just going to develop recessed,
right,
whether you like it or not. And that habit can cause way more issues for you than just a recessed jaw.
Right.
Could cause loss of dentition, bringing your immune system down, because people who mouth breathe let dirty air into their lungs as opposed to people who don't. Mm-hmm. And it's just crazy how all of that, everything that he speaks about in the book or what you have told me, really does tie into the health of the people today, because so many people do suffer with immune issues. Yeah. And then you tie that into, well, you mouth breathe, of course. You let the dirty air in and all of that.
That is an interesting point, and it's something that, he's not a physician, and obviously even physicians at that time didn't have the knowledge that we have now.
Right.
But we know a lot about immunology, And it's very interesting. We know that our skin, for example, is the best barrier to infectious diseases.
That's correct.
Right?
Unless damaged.
Right. And if it's damaged by an open wound, then we're compromised and can have illnesses or infections. And we know this.
Right.
You don't have to be a physician to know this, but we
Right.
know this. This is obvious. And we wear PPE. Everyone knows what PPE is now since the COVID era, right? Personal protective equipment. I think that's what it stands for. PPEs. But what are PPEs? Gloves to mimic skin, right? A barrier, masks and respirators to protect the lung from contaminated air. And if you think about immune system, just like skin is a major barrier for bacteria into our bloodstream, our nose is the ultimate respirator.
Correct, because of the turbinates.
Because, yes, the nose has turbinates, which humidifies the air, so it protects the lungs from cold, and it also filters the air from dust and infectious particles, just like a mask or respirator would. And I believe, similar to how skin is probably the best barrier, just like rubber gloves or plastic gloves or whatever, or nitrile gloves are not as good as our skin, I don't think masks or respirators are as good as what we have developed, designed, whatever we believe to have as humans. With a lot of perfection, we have this immune system. And if we're bypassing that by breathing through our mouth, it makes sense that can leave entry to not only temperature, like cold air, which can maybe be problematic for the lungs, but certainly infectious particles.
Right, because there's no filter in the mouth at all.
Right.
So if you're breathing in dirty air, especially while you're asleep, when your guards are down, you're more likely to get sick.
Yeah, and this is something that he really talks about a lot. Says that, when you're awake, your guards are up. When you're asleep, your guards are down. Which,
why is that though? Most people don't understand why your guards are down when you're sleeping.
Yes. So, in the obvious sense, and this is interesting, when you're asleep, whether you're in a protected house or a teepee or you're an animal outside, it's such a vulnerable place for predators.
Correct.
Or intruders, right? Because, and that makes a really interesting point. Matthew Walker wrote this in his book, that the evolutionary pressure to sleep, the benefits of sleep have to be so high. And it has to outweigh that danger of having no defenses.
Right.
To do that a third of the day or half of the day or a third of the day or more of an animal's life, whether it's human or another type of animal.
And every species respects sleep. And
every species respects sleep. Right.
They all know, like, whether you're nocturnal or not, all species need sleep and they all respect it. And I mean, even with humans, everyone knows nighttime, everyone's asleep. It's kind of like even criminals sleep.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I mean, we knew, we grew up, we knew not to make a phone call after 7 or 8 p.m.
It's disrespectful.
It's disrespectful. You got to let people sleep. But the laws of nature also let people sleep, right? Despite it being such a vulnerable, dangerous time, evolutionary pressures to sleep were that much greater.
But why are your guards down in other ways?
We'll get to that. I want to make this point, though, because it means that we really know very little still about what we're doing in our sleep, right? For it to supersede all those risks,
right,
and us to develop this way, means that sleep has to be so important that it risks everything. Right. Every single day. And I think that we still know very little about how beneficial sleep is. We know it's beneficial. We know that when we have poor sleep, that we're going to have a bad day. And when you have chronically poor sleep, you're going to have many bad days.
And you're going to be highly irritable, impatient, annoyed.
Yeah.
Everything's going to be negative.
Your hormones are going to be off balance. Your immune system's going to be challenged. You're going to have all these issues. So sleep is so important. It has to be restorative. I thought about this the other day. Is we live in this world where we have these computers and iPhones, and we make sure that we charge our iPhones every night.
Right. Why don't we charge ourselves?
Right. But sleep is how we charge. And how many people prioritize charging themselves versus charging their iPhone?
Unfortunately, not enough.
Mm-hmm.
Unfortunately, not enough.
Yeah, it's an
people
interesting
do.
point. I think Drake said this. I don't know if he came up with it. Everybody
said it?
dies, not everybody lives.
Drake said that?
I think so.
For real?
It's in a Drake song. I don't know if he came up with it, but everybody dies, not everybody lives. And I think
That
that's a
is true.
powerful statement, right? Because if
Mhm.
you're sleep deprived, are you really living your best life?
Yes, exactly. You're not. There are 3 things that a human needs in order to survive: sleep, food, and water.
Mhm.
Without either of those things, humans die.
Right.
Like, you go long enough without sleep, you're going to die. Long enough without food, you're going to die. Long enough without water, you're going to die. Those
Yeah.
are the 3 absolute necessities that we're always going to need.
Yeah, that's interesting because as you're saying that, I'm also thinking not only are those essential
Mm-hmm.
and do you need them, but you need them to be good
Exactly.
because
Yeah.
bad water will make you sick.
Exactly.
Bad food
will make you sick.
and bad sleep will make you sick.
Yeah.
Right? So
Yeah.
that's interesting. Going to the guards are down. So obviously the guards are down from the predatorial standpoint.
Correct. Yeah.
Right? But if the body is using sleep to restore and to charge, just like you're charging your iPhone,
Mm-hmm.
there's so much that's going into the system
Mm-hmm.
that the body's defense system may be down too because it's prioritizing what sleep is doing to recovery.
I don't know how right I am about this theory, but I do theorize that when you're asleep, your immune system goes down.
Yeah.
Because your body is so busy and so caught up in trying to recover from the day before and trying to prepare you for the next day that it's not worried about you getting sick. It's worried about fixing that scrape that you got on your finger the day before, or the amount of thinking that you had to do taking that exam or going through surgery. Like, it's you being a surgeon. It's time consuming, it's brain consuming, it consumes you as a person, and when you're asleep, your body is trying to recover from that because it takes a lot. It takes a toll on you. So I think because of that, your body's not worried like, oh yeah, whatever, we're not going to get sick. It's more worried about making sure that you're ready for the next day and you're making all necessary repairs before you wake up.
Right,
in
you're
order
recharging.
to function the best that you can.
Yeah. And I don't know the answer. I don't think we do know yet exactly what's happening when we're sleeping in terms of our immune system. I know that overall it's beneficial for the immune system.
Absolutely.
But I don't know what's happening when we're sleeping. But that is an observation, at least that came to this author, George Catlin. His theory was that essentially exactly what you're talking about, that the guards were down and the body was using sleep to restore and recover, so that if somebody was breathing through their mouth in their sleep, that was the most vulnerable of all times because they're letting in contaminated, unfiltered, dirty air into the lungs without the ability to fight those things.
Exactly.
And that's what he says, we're making people very ill. And it's an interesting point. I don't know how true it is or not, but I think it makes a lot of sense.
It makes absolute sense, and it's so common sense that you don't even think about it. And then you're like, wait, hold on, he said this? It's true, duh.
For sure, breathing through your mouth and bypassing the immune system is very similar to letting bacteria into an open wound.
Yeah,
right? Because you don't have your skin protecting from the outside. If you're breathing through your mouth, you don't have the nose protecting you from the outside. So it would make sense that if somebody's doing that for 8 hours a day, that could be harmful or detrimental.
And also another theory based off of what he says, but also what I have learned from you and Airway in general, mouth breathing causes other symptoms that are sometimes, they all correlate.
Right.
But not just you getting sick and having a recessed jaw, but also could lead to autoimmune disease.
And facial development. As people sleep with their mouths open, their arches become narrower and longer, right? We know, dentists know that if you're missing a lower molar, for example, and the molar above it loses that contact from below, that it does something called super erupt, meaning that upper tooth that now has no opposition starts to elongate and drift down.
Oh. Really?
because it doesn't have that stop.
Oh, that's interesting.
So if the mouth is open completely and doesn't have a stop for so many hours, it makes sense that they would super erupt, and that can contribute to these elongated faces,
and with
as well as the pressure changes that are inappropriate.
right, and with the airway issues come to
Right.
play.
And then it worsens the airway
Mm-hmm.
because the chin goes down and back.
And it causes
The tongue obstructs
obstruction.
more. And you get faces that are also not as attractive.
Yeah.
Right. They're not, I don't, maybe that's a controversial way to say it, but let's just say not
not
as healthy
controversial.
appearing.
It's not controversial, I don't think, because we have had so many patients come and complain about aesthetics for themselves. And then you're like, well, of course you feel that you don't look your best because your airway is suboptimal.
Right. And health and
correlates.
aesthetics, they correlate.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
It always correlates.
Healthy is always aesthetic.
Mm-hmm. Because symmetry is always going to be aesthetic.
Yeah.
So, but talking about breathing through your nose versus your mouth, you're saying obviously the turbinates are there to humidify.
That's exactly
and
what
filter.
I wanted to get into.
Right?
Yes.
Do you agree with turbinectomies?
Yeah, it's such an interesting point because for a long time through treating patients and seeing patients that have gone through turbinectomy, I've seen issues. There's a dreaded issue called empty nose syndrome. And in empty nose syndrome, someone has their turbinates removed. And although the passage is wide open so that air can go through unobstructed, because they're lacking their receptors now and sensors of the nose, they feel like they can't breathe, even though they have a highway.
So they feel like
breath, but they feel like they're suffocating. They can't breathe. And it's a horrible condition. It leads to depression,
anxiety.
It leads to a lot of a difficult position that really doesn't have a great treatment. Because it's hard to restore that.
Well, yeah, you can't rebuild turbinates that were resected.
Yeah, it's a problem. So I always had an issue with turbinectomies because I've seen patients suffer from some of these consequences.
What about turbinate reductions? Because there are times when they would say, oh, you just need your turbinates reduced because they're too big.
Yeah, so a reduction itself may not have the same risk to empty nose syndrome as a large turbinectomy aggressive one, but it still has that risk, smaller risk. But what we're talking about, you're removing that natural defense system. So now essentially people with turbinectomies are mouth breathers, even though they're breathing through their nose, because no matter where that air is coming through, it doesn't have the function of a healthy nose. So, it's interesting, and my ENT friends may not like me talking about this. And it's just an observation.
Right.
Made through patients and, a point brought up by this book. But
Not
I think
just this book, but there's plenty of
many,
books.
But I think it's a really interesting thing. It's like we should probably really, really revisit and reassess. The medical community should do this. ENT should do this about the value of removing turbinates rather than, obviously we know expanding the jaws is a better thing. Make room for the turbinates so people can use their noses and their natural defense systems and breathe properly. That's an issue that people that have turbinectomies essentially become mouth breathers, even though they're breathing through their nose.
Yeah, and then the whole point in fixing their health, which is the main reason they're here, they still aren't able to completely fix it because they're letting the dirty air in for the rest of their lives.
Right.
And there is no artificial way of filtering air unless you want to wear a face mask for the rest of your life, which I don't think I would want to do. No.
Yeah. This is something else that I really enjoyed reading in the book. He made an observation living with these tribes that, it's not only the native Indians that were benefiting from closing their lips and breathing through their nose, but he noticed that all the animals in the wild, every single one of them, breathes through their noses.
That is a very true observation, actually. All animals do, except for like pugs and Frenchies, because they were
and those
bred
are
that
domesticated
way.
And they have the same luxuries as the people he's describing in the civilized world. But wild animals, with no exception, they all breathe through their nose, right? And an interesting point that he makes about that, in terms of aesthetics, all these animals have the same faces.
Perfectly
You know,
symmetric faces, most
symmetric
of them.
faces. They develop their teeth. They hold on to their teeth.
Mm-hmm.
But
No
a wolf
crowding.
looks like a wolf,
Yeah.
right? These animals, a horse looks like a horse,
Mm-hmm.
and so on and so forth. But animals have faces that you can tell that they were designed to have.
Mm-hmm.
But that's different in humans. We have very different faces. And I'm not talking about, obviously everyone is like a fingerprint. Their faces
Right.
are different. I'm not talking about,
Like everyone looking the
different
same.
features. I'm talking about we have very different skeletal features that are problematic,
Mm-hmm.
right? Long faces, recessed faces, narrow faces, crowded teeth. These are not appropriate.
I would argue that there's more people today who need braces than they ever have. And I attribute that to mouth breathing.
Yeah, I think that's true. You hear me talk about this often, that when things are so common, we
Mm-hmm.
think they're normal.
Yeah.
Or appropriate. But really the fact that 90% or more of the population needs braces because of teeth crowding,
Mm-hmm.
that's not appropriate.
Yeah, it's more uncommon for you not to need braces, which is so crazy when you think about it, because your mouth and your teeth should develop naturally in the place where they belong,
Mm-hmm.
and they don't because of environmental factors, habits, etc.
Mm-hmm. And I think this nasal breathing versus mouth breathing is so critical, so important. I think that everybody should read this book.
I agree.
It's fascinating.
I agree.
It really is.
I would totally read it, but he already gave me not just a high level summary, but a very
play-by-play.
in-depth play-by-play. I know exactly what happens on every single page of this book. So I will not be reading it because you already told me what goes on, and I cannot read something once I have all the spoilers.
You do have all the information.
But I do suggest this for everybody and anybody who's trying to learn about not just airway, but the importance of nasal breathing versus mouth breathing, because it's not just a trend.
Mm-hmm.
It's actually legitimately a health concern.
Right.
And I love seeing health trends on TikTok and Instagram and on social media when they actually do benefit the populace.
Right.
It's great.
So you talk about that, and let's talk about mewing then.
Yeah.
Because
I love
he
mewing.
actually, in this book, is describing and advocating for what we know now as mewing.
Mm-hmm.
And he says that the deliberate action of closing your lips, breathing through your nose, putting your teeth together, putting your tongue to the roof of your mouth, will shape the face in a beneficial way.
Mm-hmm.
That's essentially what mewing is and why it became popular, from Dr. Mew, who's alive today. But this was something he described 200 years ago, and is really what he's advocating for in this book. So I thought that was fascinating. The other thing I thought was fascinating is that he acknowledges that, growing up in London in a civilized community, he didn't have the privileges of what the native Indians developed through nasal breathing. He was a mouth breather, and he was late to the game. But even though he was late to the game, in that time, he understood the importance of it, and he began essentially mewing. Obviously, it wasn't called that. It was his version of it. He was doing what the native Indians did. And he said that he saw changes in his health for better health and happier life, but he also saw changes in his face. And one of the chapters in the book, he's really reaching out to young children and young adults and telling them, hey, you want to live a good life, have a beautiful face, then you need to start doing this. So I thought that was really interesting.
I mean,
seeing that it came 200 years ago, and this was something that he wrote for the medical community to benefit from, and it was really never accepted.
if that doesn't tell you everything you need to know, I don't know what does.
Yeah, so look at this book, pick it up. Definitely, if you like what you're hearing, subscribe. We're going to be on here every week. You'll see a podcast every week talking about health, breathing,
Airway,
jaws, airway, biohacking, and
all things health.
All things good, personal development, and just interesting things. We'll have interesting guests here. So make sure to subscribe.
Yeah, it won't always be me.